Oh! Take your hand off me, officer. You're under arrest!
The first breath of a major fire has a taste. It's a bitter cocktail of scorched plastic, vaporized chemicals, and something anciently organic like burning wood, even when there's none. Marcus Thorne tasted it on the back of his tongue the moment he stepped out of the ambulance. At 48, with 25 years of service stitched into the fabric of his paramedic uniform, Marcus had developed a sixth sense for chaos, a palate for disaster. He was a large man, built like the defensive tackle he'd once been in college, with a presence that seemed to absorb the panic around him, leaving a pocket of calm in his wake. His hands, steady and sure, had brought more souls back from the brink than he could count. The call had come in at 2:14 p.m. on a sweltering August afternoon. Multi-agency response, commercial structure fire, West Industrial Park, possible entrapment. His partner, Sarah Jenkins, a sharp, energetic woman 15 years his junior, had the sirens screaming before the dispatcher finished the sentence. Sarah was the perfect partner, quick-thinking, efficient, and she understood the silent language of a shared crisis. A raised eyebrow from Marcus meant, "Get the backboard." A slight nod meant, "Start a line, wide open." "Looks like a bad one, Mark," she said, expertly maneuvering the heavy vehicle through traffic that parted like the Red Sea. "They're all bad ones, Sarah," Marcus replied, his voice a low, steady baritone that had calmed frantic mothers and reassured dying men. His eyes were already scanning the horizon, fixed on the column of greasy black smoke clawing at the clear blue sky. It was a chemical signature. Not wood, not paper. This was plastics, industrial solvents, the kind of fire that created its own weather system. This was his world. Not the quiet hum of the station or the easy banter between calls, but this, the forward momentum into the heart of a crisis, the symphony of sirens converging on a single point of human failure or misfortune. He had learned long ago that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. In his line of work, calm wasn't just a state of mind, it was a life-saving instrument. As they neared the scene, the chaos resolved into horrifying detail. A sprawling single-story warehouse, home to a plastics manufacturing company, was vomiting thick, toxic clouds from its corrugated metal roof. Flames licked out of shattered windows, a hungry orange against the blackening walls. Fire engines from 3 different battalions were already on site, a fortress of red and chrome. Hoses snaked across the asphalt like giant pythons, and the air thrummed with the roar of pumpers and the sharp crackle of the blaze. Sarah brought the ambulance to a stop at the designated staging area, a safe distance from the immediate danger, but close enough for rapid deployment. Even before the engine was cut, Marcus was running a mental checklist. Burn severity, smoke inhalation, potential for crush injuries from structural collapse. His mind was a library of protocols, each one cataloged and ready. He pulled on a pair of fresh nitrile gloves, the familiar snap against his wrists a small, focusing ritual that signaled the beginning of the battle. "All right, let's establish our triage and treatment area," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Right here by the battalion chief's car. It's uphill, upwind, and has a clear access route. Get the backboards and the O2 ready. I'll coordinate with the chief." The battalion chief, a grizzled veteran named O'Malley, saw him coming and gave a curt nod. "Thorne, glad it's you. We've got 2 down, brought out by the first attack team. Smoke inhalation and some burns. They're over there." He pointed toward a cluster of firefighters. "We might have 1 more still inside. They're doing a secondary search now." "Understood, Chief," Marcus said. "My treatment area is established behind your vehicle. Send them to me as they come out." He turned and surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. Firefighters moved with disciplined urgency. Police officers were working to push back a growing crowd of onlookers. The air was thick with shouted commands and the hiss of water hitting superheated metal. In this maelstrom, his job was to create a small island of order. a place where the science of saving lives could be practiced. He paced out the area, visualizing the flow. Triage here, critical care here, walking wounded there. It was a space defined not by walls, but by purpose. This 50-square-foot patch of asphalt would be his emergency room, his operating theater, his church. It was sacred ground, a bulwark against the encroaching inferno. He was about to lay the first triage tarp, green for minor injuries, when a new presence entered his carefully constructed zone, bringing with it an energy that felt jarringly out of place. It was a police officer, young and radiating an aggressive energy that set Marcus on edge instantly. The officer was in his late 20s, with a tightly shaved head and the kind of physique that came from a gym, not from labor. His uniform was crisp, his movements sharp and impatient. The nameplate on his chest read, N. Riley. He strode into Marcus's intended triage area as if he owned it, unspooling a roll of yellow police tape. "All right, I'm clearing this whole section," Officer Riley announced to no one in particular, his voice sharp with authority. "This is the collapse zone. The perimeter needs to be another 50 feet back." He gestured vaguely with his hand toward the parking lot, far from the engine crews and the immediate access point for incoming patients. Marcus stopped, the green tarp still in his hand. He had worked alongside hundreds of cops in his career. There was a protocol, a dance of mutual respect between agencies. The fire department controlled the immediate fire ground, paramedics controlled patient care, and the police controlled the external scene and traffic. Riley's unilateral declaration violated that unwritten code. "Excuse me, officer," Marcus said, his tone even and professional. He never started a conversation on a scene with anything but respect. "I'm setting up patient triage here. This is the designated medical command post, upwind and with the best access for incoming units." Officer Riley paused, turning to face Marcus. His sunglasses hid his eyes, creating an impassive mask, but his stance, feet planted wide, hands on his utility belt, was a universal sign of confrontation. "The fire captain doesn't draw my perimeter," he said, his voice flat. "This area is a potential collapse zone. I'm moving everyone back. It's a matter of officer safety." Marcus glanced at the warehouse. The main body of fire was on the far side of the building. The near wall, while blackened, showed no signs of imminent failure. Chief O'Malley, a man with 30 years of experience reading burning buildings, had implicitly approved this spot. "With all due respect," Marcus said, keeping his voice low, "Chief O'Malley has designated this the staging area. We need to be here to receive patients directly from the attack teams. Moving us 50 feet back could add a critical minute to our treatment time, a minute a non-breathing man doesn't have." He wasn't trying to be difficult. He was stating a fact of his profession. Time was measured in heartbeats and brain cells. Proximity was not a convenience. It was a clinical necessity. The space he had chosen was a calculated risk, balancing safety with the urgent demands of emergency medicine. Riley's jaw tightened. He seemed to take Marcus's explanation not as professional input, but as insubordination. "I'm not going to have a bunch of medics getting crushed by a falling wall on my watch. That creates more victims, more problems. The line goes here." He stretched the yellow tape between a fire truck and a police cruiser, effectively bisecting the area Marcus had designated. The tape was a physical manifestation of his authority, a yellow line drawn in the smoke. "Officer," Marcus tried again, "we accept the risk. It's part of our job. We need to be able to access our equipment and treat patients as they are brought out. Your perimeter is unworkable for medical operations." "Then make it workable," Riley snapped, his voice rising. "I give an order, you follow it. It's that simple." Something cold settled in Marcus's gut. This wasn't about safety. He'd seen genuine concern for safety from officers before, and it felt different. It was collaborative. This was about power. Riley was young, full of testosterone, and felt the need to establish his dominance on a chaotic scene where his role was, frankly, secondary to that of the fire and medical crews. He was a hammer, seeing every problem as a nail. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw two firefighters emerge from the smoke, supporting a third man between them. The downed firefighter was coughing violently, his face pale under a layer of soot. He was stumbling, clearly in respiratory distress. "Patient coming out!" Sarah yelled, already grabbing the oxygen tank and a non-rebreather mask. The firefighters were heading directly for Marcus's area. But now, a thin yellow line stood in their way. Officer Riley stood beside it, arms crossed, a sentinel guarding a meaningless border. Marcus knew he had a choice to make. He could retreat, move his equipment, and waste precious time. Or he could hold his ground for the sake of the man who was currently choking on superheated smoke and carcinogens. For Marcus, it wasn't a choice at all. "Get him over here!" Marcus commanded, his voice booming with the authority of a quarter-century of life-and-death decisions. He ducked under the yellow tape without a second thought, gesturing for the firefighters to follow. "Sarah, let's get him on high-flow O2 and check his vitals. I want a full set of lung sounds." The firefighters, seeing a paramedic taking charge, didn't hesitate. They brought their struggling colleague right to Marcus, bypassing the arbitrary line Officer Riley had drawn. For them, the choice was simple. Get their brother to the medic. Officer Riley's face contorted with fury. He strode forward, planting himself directly in front of Marcus. "Did you not hear me? I told you this area was off limits," he yelled, his voice cracking with indignation. The spittle flew from his lips. Marcus didn't even look at him. His world had narrowed to the man on the cot in front of him. The firefighter, a young man named Dave, was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. His skin was clammy, and his eyes were wide with a mixture of pain and fear. Marcus placed his stethoscope on the man's chest, listening intently. "I hear wheezing in the upper lobes. Possible airway burns," Marcus said to Sarah, his voice a calm, clinical instrument. "Let's start him on a nebulizer with albuterol, and get a line in just in case we need to push steroids." "Officer, this is a critical medical scene," Sarah interjected, trying to run interference while holding an oxygen mask to Dave's face. "My partner's duty is to the patient. We can discuss the perimeter later." "There's nothing to discuss," Riley shot back, his focus entirely on Marcus, who was effectively ignoring him. "You!" he barked, pointing a rigid finger at Marcus's chest. "I gave you a lawful order to stay back. You deliberately disobeyed it. You crossed my perimeter." "And I am following my lawful duty as a licensed paramedic to provide life-saving care," Marcus retorted, his eyes still locked on his patient. He didn't raise his voice. He kept it professional, but there was an edge of steel in it now. "Your perimeter is interfering with that duty. Now, you can either help us by keeping the area clear, or you can step back and let us do our jobs." The challenge was laid bare. It was a direct conflict of jurisdiction, a head-on collision between two non-negotiable duties. In Marcus's world, the sanctity of patient care was absolute. In Riley's world, the sanctity of a police officer's order was paramount. The confrontation had drawn an audience. A small cluster of police officers and firefighters had paused, watching the standoff unfold. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the fire. This was a different kind of blaze, one fueled by ego and pride. "I need to see your identification," Riley said, his voice low and menacing. He had shifted tactics. If he couldn't intimidate him with volume, he would bog him down in procedure. "My identification is in my wallet in the ambulance," Marcus said without looking up. "My name is Marcus Thorne, and my state license number is on the patch on my sleeve. You are welcome to verify it through your dispatch, but I am not stopping treatment of a man with potential airway compromise to show you my driver's license." "So you're refusing to identify yourself?" Riley pressed, twisting his words. "I'm refusing to abandon my patient," Marcus corrected him, his patience, a deep and usually unshakable well, finally running dry. He looked up, meeting the officer's glare for the first time. The sunglasses couldn't hide the raw fury in the set of his jaw. "There's a difference." The firefighter on the cot, Dave, let out a strangled cough, his body tensing. His oxygen saturation, displayed on the portable monitor Sarah had attached to his finger, dipped ominously. "His sats are dropping to 88, Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "Mark, his breathing is getting worse." That was it. The debate was over. Marcus turned his full attention back to his patient, effectively dismissing the officer standing inches away. "We need to move. Now!" he commanded. "Let's get him packaged for transport. We need to get him to the burn unit at University Hospital. The hospital is his best chance." He and Sarah moved as one, preparing the gurney, securing the patient, a whirlwind of efficient, practiced motion. As they positioned their hands to lift Dave onto the stretcher, Officer Riley moved. He didn't just stand in the way, he stepped forward and placed a heavy hand directly on Marcus's shoulder, shoving him back. "I told you," Riley growled, his face inches from Marcus's. "You don't get to decide what happens here, I do." The world seemed to slow to a crawl. The roar of the fire engines, the shouts of the crews, the hiss of the water, it all faded into a distant hum. Marcus's entire consciousness was focused on the 5 points of pressure where the officer's fingers dug into his shoulder. It was a shocking violation, a crossing of a line so fundamental it took his breath away. In 25 years, through riots and shootouts and multi-car pileups, no one had ever laid a hand on him while he was treating a patient. He looked from Riley's hand on his shoulder up to the officer's mirrored sunglasses, which reflected a distorted image of his own face, his expression a mask of cold disbelief. The air crackled. This was no longer a disagreement over jurisdiction. This was an assault. "Take your hand off me, officer," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. Each word was a chip of ice. "You're under arrest," Riley declared, his voice booming with a sense of triumphant finality. He seemed to relish the words, the ultimate expression of his authority. The statement was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation, that for a moment Marcus could only stare at him. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a fellow first responder suffer. For doing the very job he had sworn an oath to do. Sarah gasped. The firefighters who had been watching froze, their faces a canvas of disbelief. "Arrested for what?" Marcus demanded, shrugging off Riley's hand with a sharp, powerful movement. He immediately turned back to his patient, his focus absolute. "Sarah, we are leaving. Now." He was done talking. He was done negotiating with this man's fragile ego. A life was on the line, and he would not let Officer Nolan Riley be the reason it was lost. But as he and Sarah tensed to lift the gurney, Riley acted. He grabbed Marcus again, not by the shoulder this time, but by the upper arm, and violently yanked him backward. Marcus, caught off balance, stumbled away from the patient. A portable medical tray, laden with IV supplies and medication vials, tipped over, its contents spilling and scattering across the dirty asphalt. Syringes, gauze pads, saline flushes, the tools of his trade, were strewn like discarded toys. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Riley shouted, his voice ringing with victory. He spun Marcus around with surprising force, wrenching his arms behind his back with a practiced, brutal efficiency. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around Marcus's wrists. The sharp click, 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 as the ratchet tightened, was the loudest sound Marcus had ever heard. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic fighting for a life was treated like a common felon. The bite of the metal into his skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. He was a healer, and he was being shackled. "My patient!" Marcus cried out, his professional composure finally shattering. His voice was raw with a desperation that was completely foreign to him. He twisted his head, his eyes finding Sarah, who stood frozen in horror. "Sarah, don't stop! You have to get him to the hospital! Go!" His plea snapped her out of her shock. Her training took over. With tears of rage streaming down her soot-stained cheeks, she turned back to Dave, her hands, though shaking, moving with renewed purpose. She was alone now. The scene erupted. The firefighters, who had been hesitant witnesses, were now an angry mob. They surged forward, shouting at Riley, their voices a chorus of outrage. "What the hell are you doing? He was helping him!" "You're out of your damn mind, Riley! We've got you on camera, you idiot!" Cell phones were held high, their lenses recording every second of the travesty. Riley seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's reaction, but his jaw hardened. He shoved Marcus toward his patrol car, his hand firmly in the center of Marcus's back, propelling him away from the patient, away from his partner, away from his duty. As he was forced away from the scene, Marcus's eyes remained locked on his patient. He saw Sarah struggling to manage the gurney and the IV bag by herself. He saw the man's color worsening, his breathing growing more labored. He knew with a sickening certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing Dave precious time, precious oxygen, a precious chance at a full recovery. Every second that ticked by while he was being marched to a police car was a second his patient's lungs were scarring. The door of the patrol car was hot to the touch. Riley pushed him unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing him in a cage of plastic and metal. He was a paramedic, one of the good guys, cuffed in the back of a police car, watching his own partner and a fellow first responder struggle because of the man who had just locked him away. The betrayal was a physical weight in his chest. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of his stomach. This would not stand. Officer Nolan Riley had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The vinyl seat stuck to Marcus's uniform, and the handcuffs, cinched tight behind his back, dug into his wrists with every slight movement. The air was thick with the sterile smell of plastic and the faint, acrid scent of old vomit. Through the metal partition, he watched Officer Riley. He stood beside his driver's side door, speaking into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. His back was to Marcus, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, turning Marcus's life-saving actions into a story of obstruction, his professional urgency into a tale of non-compliance. Marcus pressed his face against the hot window, his gaze fixed on the scene he'd been torn from. He saw two other firefighters rush to Sarah's side, helping her get Dave's gurney rolling toward her ambulance. It was a testament to the brotherhood of first responders. They would not let their own falter. But the delay was unforgivable. At least a full 5 minutes had been stolen from the patient, 5 minutes of critical care and transport time sacrificed on the altar of one officer's ego. Finally, the other ambulance, with Sarah behind the wheel and another medic in the back with Dave, pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren cutting a path through the chaos. Marcus watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient he had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over him, even though he knew logically that the failure was not his own. Officer Riley finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty, only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. "That man has compromised airways," Marcus said, the words breaking the silence. He needed to say it. He needed this officer to acknowledge the consequence of his actions. Because of you, because you needed to prove a point, his chances of a full recovery just went down. I hope your ego is worth a man's lungs. Riley's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Marcus leaned his head back against the hard plastic seat and closed his eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted Marcus in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. The drive to the county booking facility was a journey from one battlefield to another. He had lost the first skirmish. He would not lose the war. The Central Pretrial Detention Facility was a place Marcus knew well, but only from the outside. He had brought countless patients here, intoxicated individuals, people suffering mental health crises, who needed medical clearance before being booked. He had always been on the other side of the divide, a respected professional in a clean uniform. Now he was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind him, echoing the finality of his situation. Officer Riley gripped his arm, steering him through the corridors as if he were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered his uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A paramedic in cuffs was not a common sight. Riley pushed him toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a man in his 50s with a graying mustache and a nameplate that read, Kowalski. "Got one for booking," Riley announced, his voice unnecessarily loud. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Kowalski looked up from his paperwork, his gaze falling on Marcus, then on Riley. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Resisting him?" He looked back at Marcus. "I know you. You're Thorne. You brought in that guy who fell off the roof last month. What in God's name is going on, Riley?" "He refused to follow a lawful order at a scene," Riley said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Interfered with my perimeter." "What scene?" Kowalski pressed, his tone sharp. He wasn't buying it. "The warehouse fire on West Industrial? I heard the chatter. Firefighter down, respiratory distress. What exactly did he obstruct? His ability to breathe?" The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Riley's face flushed a deep red. He refused to provide identification and became belligerent. "Sergeant, I was treating a critical patient," Marcus interjected, his voice calm and measured. "I informed your officer that I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized for transport. His life was the priority." Kowalski's eyes narrowed, looking from Marcus's resolute face to Riley's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for 30 years. He could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. "You pulled a medic away from a critical patient to ask for his driver's license?" he asked Riley, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that what you're telling me?" "I was securing the scene," Riley insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. Kowalski just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He turned to the booking officer. "Process him, and be quick about it. Get his union rep on the phone." He shot a final withering glare at Riley. "My office, now!" The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Marcus's fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on his skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing his exhausted but defiant expression. He was instructed to remove his personal belongings, his wallet, which contained his driver's license and his paramedic certifications, his phone, his watch, his wedding ring. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and catalogued with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Riley had deemed more important than a man's life was now being handled as evidence of his supposed crime. After the paperwork was complete, a young officer led Marcus down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer muttered, unable to meet his eyes. "It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Marcus was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple, a concrete bench and a stainless steel toilet. He sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through his uniform. For the first time since the call came in, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. He had dedicated his life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm. And for doing his job, for doing what was right, he had been locked in a cage. He put his head in his hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and he was going to hold it accountable. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Marcus measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. He heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for his injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. He replayed the encounter with Riley in his mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could he have handled it differently? Should he have been more compliant, moved his gear, and hoped for the best for Dave? The answer, every single time, was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of his patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for a perimeter superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle he would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold, concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about his colleague's fate. He'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes, when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but the sharp, confident click of hard-soled dress shoes. A woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray pantsuit stopped in front of his cell door. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single sweeping glance, and a cascade of salt and pepper curls tied back professionally. She carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Marcus Thorne?" she asked, her voice calm and commanding. Marcus stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm an attorney with the First Responders Union," she said. "Your partner Sarah called your supervisor called the union president, and the president called me. I broke 6 traffic laws getting here." She offered a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her intense eyes. "Let's get you out of this ridiculous situation." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over Marcus. He wasn't alone anymore. The system he had dedicated his life to was now fighting for him. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Reed said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "I've already had a word with Sergeant Kowalski. He's displeased with his officer's conduct, to put it mildly. But the arrest report has been filed. Officer Riley is doubling down, claiming you were aggressive and non-compliant. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Marcus began his story with the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history. He recounted the entire event: the dispatch call, the nature of the fire, his establishment of the triage zone based on protocol and best practices. Then he described Officer Riley's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate demands. He detailed his repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, Riley's refusal to listen, his escalation, the physical assault, and the arrest. Evelyn Reed listened intently, her pen flying across the page, her expression growing grimmer with every word. She would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. "Did he ever state a credible reason for the perimeter being exactly where he put it, other than officer safety?" "No. The building was not showing signs of collapse in our area." "Did he show any concern for the firefighters' well-being?" "None. His only concern was establishing his authority and seeing my ID." "And you told him where your ID was?" "I told him it was in the ambulance and he could verify my credentials with my partner or dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient." Reed nodded, a grim satisfaction on her face. "That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key." She looked up from her notes. "Marcus, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call, it was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you." She closed her notepad. "They'll release you within the hour. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Riley arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law." "What about my patient?" Marcus asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. "The firefighter, Dave, do you know anything?" Evelyn's expression softened. Sarah gave me an update. He was transported to University Hospital. He had to be intubated in the ambulance. The initial diagnosis is severe smoke inhalation and possible thermal damage to his upper airway. He's in the ICU. The next 48 hours are critical. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The delay in transport. It's going to be a major factor in this case. A very major factor. True to Evelyn Reed's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Kowalski was standing there, his expression stern. "You're being released on your own recognizance, Thorne. The charges are being reviewed, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over them." He handed Marcus the plastic bag with his belongings. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line." Marcus just nodded, taking his property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As he walked out of the station with Evelyn at his side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, he felt like he was surfacing after being held underwater. He was free, but he wasn't whole. A part of him was still back on that smoky asphalt, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. And another part of him was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Sarah was waiting for him in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance. Her uniform was rumpled, and her face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She straightened up as soon as she saw him, rushing forward to pull him into a firm, sisterly hug. "Mark, my God, are you okay?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," he said, pulling back. "Tell me about Dave. What's the latest?" Sarah's face clouded over. She took a deep breath. "It's bad, Mark. Really bad. I stayed at the hospital until his wife got there. The pulmonologist came out to talk to them. Because of the delay and the prolonged exposure, the damage to his lungs is severe. They're worried about ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. They have him in a medically induced coma to let his body heal." She looked down, her fist clenching. "The doctor, he asked me point blank why it took us so long to initiate transport from the scene. He said those 5 or 6 minutes. They likely made all the difference between a serious injury and a potentially catastrophic one." The words landed like stones in Marcus's stomach. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient. But this was different. This wasn't a loss to a disease or an unavoidable injury. This was a potential loss to a man's ego. Those precious minutes Riley had stolen from them while he postured and demanded and finally arrested him were the minutes Dave's lungs were filling with fluid, the minutes his life was draining away. The image of Riley's smug face flashed in his mind, and his simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. "His family?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "His wife, 2 kids in high school. They're devastated. They know what happened. The guys from the engine company told them everything." Evelyn Reed, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. Her expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," she said. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Riley's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Marcus. We're talking about a man who may be permanently disabled or die because a police officer couldn't handle being told no." They drove to Reed's office, a sleek, modern space in a downtown high-rise that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Marcus gave a formal recorded statement. Reed's team was already at work, filing motions, contacting witnesses, and drafting the initial complaint. A paralegal brought in sworn affidavits from 3 of the firefighters who had recorded the incident on their phones. Their videos, though shaky, were damning. They clearly showed Marcus providing medical care. They captured Riley's aggressive demands, and they recorded the moment he pulled Marcus off the patient and cuffed him. "The city's first move will be to try and discredit you," Reed explained as they reviewed the evidence. "They'll dig into your record, your personal life, anything they can find to paint you as an unstable, insubordinate hothead. But they're going to come up empty. Your service record is impeccable. You have commendations for valor. You have 0 disciplinary actions against you in 25 years. You are, for lack of a better term, the perfect plaintiff. She pointed to a paragraph in the draft of the lawsuit. We are filing a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. We will argue that Officer Riley, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. Furthermore, we are adding a state-level claim for intentional interference with emergency medical care, false arrest, and battery. She looked him directly in the eye. We will be suing Officer Riley individually and the city for failure to train and supervise its officers. We are not just going after the soldier. We are going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared. The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Nolan Riley and the city as defendants and sought unspecified damages for the violation of Marcus's civil rights, emotional distress, and damage to his professional reputation. Within an hour, the first volley of a long war had been fired. The lawsuit landed like a bomb. Within hours, the media storm began. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle. A hero paramedic arrested by an overzealous cop while saving a fellow first responder's life. The witness videos, which had been sent to a local news station by an anonymous source, a firefighter who was tired of Riley's antics, went viral. The image of Marcus Thorne, a respected veteran medic in his uniform, being forced into the back of a patrol car while his patient lay on a gurney just feet away, was broadcast across the country. The visual was jarring, a visceral depiction of priorities gone horribly wrong. It was a story that required no spin, no complex explanation. People understood it instinctively. The healer was shackled while the wounded suffered. Marcus's phone, which he'd gotten back with his other belongings, began to light up with calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues from across the state, all expressing their shock and unwavering support. "We stand with you, Mark," read a text from a paramedic in another county. "That could have been any one of us." The fire department issued a statement standing firmly behind Marcus, calling his actions heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care. The firefighters' union went a step further, releasing a blistering statement that condemned the reckless and dangerous actions of the police officer on scene and demanding a full independent investigation. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse defensive statement saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Riley had been placed on administrative desk duty. The phrase, pending investigation, was the bureaucratic equivalent of a stone wall, a tactic designed to deflect and delay. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. The battle lines had been drawn. On one side stood Marcus, with the backing of his union, Evelyn Reed, and a groundswell of public and professional support. On the other stood Officer Riley, and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. A war Marcus had never asked for, but one he was now fully committed to winning. Life became surreal. The department, seeking to protect both him and itself from further complications, placed him on paid administrative leave. He went from running a dozen calls a day to sitting in endless meetings with lawyers. The quiet of his home felt unnatural. He missed the siren, the adrenaline, the simple, profound purpose of his job. He tried to keep a low profile, but his face was everywhere. He'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping him to shake his hand and thank him for standing up. "You did the right thing," a retired teacher told him in the produce aisle, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of them. For every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. Evelyn Reed used the intense media scrutiny to her advantage, keeping the pressure on the city. "They are feeling the heat," she told Marcus during one of their strategy sessions. "The mayor is getting hammered. The police chief is hiding from reporters. They want this to go away. Quietly." The city's strategy quickly became clear: stall, deny, and hope the public's attention would move on. Their lawyers filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, calling it frivolous and claiming Officer Riley was protected by qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shields government officials from liability. "It's a standard tactic," Evelyn explained, her tone dismissive. "They're trying to bog us down, bleed us dry. They know the motion will fail, but it buys them time." As the legal gears ground slowly, the human story at the center of it all continued to unfold. Dave, the injured firefighter, was brought out of his medically induced coma after 10 days. The news was grim. While he had survived, the severe inflammation had caused permanent scarring in his lungs. His breathing capacity was significantly reduced. He would never fight a fire again. He would likely be on oxygen for the rest of his life. He was 38 years old. The news was a gut punch to Marcus. It transformed the abstract legal principles of his lawsuit into a concrete, tragic reality. This was the cost of Riley's 7-minute tantrum. A man's career, his health, his future, all sacrificed for a strip of yellow tape. It removed any last shred of doubt Marcus might have had about pursuing the lawsuit to its end. This was no longer just about his arrest. It was about getting justice for Dave. The lawsuit, the viral videos, and Dave's tragic prognosis had coalesced into a perfect storm. The city's wall of denial was beginning to crack under the relentless pressure. They were losing in the media, and they knew they had a catastrophic case on their hands. It was only a matter of time before they tried to make it disappear. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Evelyn Reed received a call from the city attorney's office. It was the call she had been expecting. "They want to talk settlement," she told Marcus over the phone. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are, to see if they can buy our silence on the cheap." "What are they offering?" Marcus asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble." She paused, letting the number sink in. "They called it a nuisance value settlement." Marcus was silent for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head, a pittance meant to make the problem go away before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. It was a number that said, "We don't believe you were harmed, but here's some cash to shut you up." The offer was more infuriating than the arrest itself. The arrest was the act of one arrogant officer. The settlement offer was the calculated act of an entire system, a system that had looked at the facts, the videos, the witnesses, the catastrophic injury to a firefighter, and decided that Marcus's humiliation and Dave's lungs were worth less than the cost of a new police cruiser. "Tell them no," Marcus said, his voice laced with ice. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Evelyn replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive, and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure would make you fold. They misjudged you." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Marcus's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that his fight was no longer just about his own vindication. It had become about Dave. It had become about every paramedic who had ever been told to stand down while a patient was crashing. The city's refusal to take his lawsuit seriously had the opposite effect they intended. Instead of silencing him, it galvanized him. And when news of the nuisance value offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Evelyn's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Marcus's fire station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as California and New York sent messages of solidarity. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Riley's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Riley, in his short 6-year career, had accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. The lowball offer and the revelations about Riley's past painted a clear picture for the public. This was not an isolated incident involving one good cop having a bad day. This was a pattern of behavior from a problem officer, enabled by a department that failed to hold him accountable. Marcus's decision to reject the offer was a turning point. It signaled to the city that he could not be bought or intimidated. It told the world that this fight was about principle. The city had tried to put a price tag on his silence. In doing so, they had inadvertently amplified his voice, turning his personal battle into a national crusade for the rights and respect of all first responders. They had wanted to quietly bury the story. Instead, they had handed Marcus a megaphone. The war was just getting started. While Marcus's legal battle raged in the headlines and court filings, the quiet, painful reality of its consequences was playing out in a sterile room in the pulmonary rehabilitation wing of University Hospital. Dave Miller, the 38-year-old firefighter Marcus had been treating, was the living, breathing embodiment of the lawsuit's central claim, that the actions of Officer Nolan Riley had caused catastrophic, measurable harm. Evelyn Reed knew that for a jury to truly understand the gravity of what had happened, they needed to see beyond the legal arguments. They needed to see the human cost. She arranged for a videographer to take a day-in-the-life deposition of Dave, a tool often used in personal injury cases to show a plaintiff's daily struggles. Marcus was not present for the taping, but Evelyn showed it to him later in her office. Watching it was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. The video began with Dave's wife, Jessica, helping him sit up in bed. The strong, capable man who had once carried heavy equipment into burning buildings now struggled to catch his breath after the simple exertion of shifting his weight. A clear plastic tube ran from his nostrils to a large, humming oxygen concentrator by his bed. The machine was his constant companion, the background music to his new life. "Mornings are the hardest," Jessica explained to the camera, her voice strained but steady. "The fluid settles in his lungs overnight. It's like trying to breathe through a wet sponge." The video followed Dave through his grueling daily routine. There was the array of pills, steroids to fight inflammation, inhalers to open his airways, medications to prevent blood clots. There was the respiratory therapy, painful sessions of deep breathing exercises that often ended with him collapsing in a fit of coughing, his face turning a terrifying shade of purple. The most heart-wrenching scene was filmed in the hospital's small rehab gym. Dave, wearing a portable oxygen tank on his back, was attempting to walk on a treadmill at the slowest possible speed. His 2 teenage sons stood on either side of him, not touching but ready to catch him if he fell. He managed about 30 seconds before the monitors tracking his blood oxygen level began to beep frantically. He had to stop, leaning heavily on the machine's handrails, gasping for air, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. In a sit-down interview portion, Dave spoke directly to the camera, his voice raspy and interrupted by frequent pauses to breathe. "I loved my job," he said, his eyes welling up. "It was who I was. Since I was a kid, all I ever wanted to do was be a firefighter, to help people. They took that from me." He looked away for a moment, composing himself. "I don't blame the fire. Fires happen. I knew the risks going in. Every firefighter does. But this didn't have to happen." He looked back at the camera, his gaze direct and piercing. I remember lying on that gurney. I remember hearing the paramedic, hearing Marcus, working on me. I heard his voice, calm, telling me what he was doing. And then I heard the other guy, the cop, yelling, angry. I felt the gurney stop moving. I couldn't see much, but I knew we weren't leaving. And I remember thinking, why aren't we leaving? I can't breathe. Why aren't we going? That's the part that I can't get out of my head. Lying there, suffocating while some guy with a badge was having a power trip. His words were devastatingly powerful. They cut through all the legalese and procedural arguments. This was the testimony that mattered. This was the human cost of a 7-minute delay. When Evelyn turned the video off, the conference room was silent. Marcus stared at the blank screen, his heart heavy. He felt a profound, aching sense of responsibility, even though he knew he was not to blame. He was the one who was supposed to protect Dave, and he had been prevented from doing so. The city's lawyers have seen this, Evelyn said softly. Dave's family has filed their own lawsuit, as they should. Their case and your case are now inextricably linked. Every victory for you is a victory for him. She leaned forward, her expression intense. This video, Dave's testimony, this is why we don't take the $50,000 insult. This is why we don't settle for anything less than complete and total justice. We are not just fighting for your reputation, Marcus. We are fighting for his life. We are going to make the city pay for every single breath that man has to struggle for. The video had given their case a soul. It was no longer an abstract fight about civil rights. It was a fight for Dave Miller. And it was a fight Marcus Thorne was now more determined than ever to win. The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears. It is a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data. For months, Evelyn Reed's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city. Training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Riley's complete, unredacted personnel file. The file was a revelation. It painted a portrait of a young officer with a troubling pattern of aggression and a clear disdain for authority figures other than his own superiors. There were multiple complaints from citizens about his condescending attitude during traffic stops, 2 excessive force complaints that were deemed unsubstantiated by internal affairs, and a formal reprimand for a verbal altercation with a fire captain at a previous emergency scene. He was a ticking time bomb, and the department had repeatedly failed to defuse him. But all of it, the paperwork, the reports, the history of complaints, was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier, an item so critical it was logged as Exhibit A before they even viewed it. The unedited footage from Officer Nolan Riley's body camera. Evelyn had it set up in a conference room on a large, high-definition monitor. Marcus sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sarah was there, too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. This was the unblinking eye, the objective witness that would either confirm or contradict everything they had claimed. "Are you ready for this?" Evelyn asked Marcus gently. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Riley got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear, even more so than on the cell phone videos. The roar of the highway, the crackle of his own radio, and his own heavy, impatient breathing. Then, he began walking toward the scene. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the fire engines, his voice already sharp as he waved bystanders back. "Get back! All of you move it! Now!" Then the camera centered on him. A version of Marcus kneeling on the ground, his back mostly to the camera, completely engrossed in his patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the soot on Dave Miller's face, the shallow, desperate gasps for air he was taking. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that he was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Marcus remembered. "Step away from him," Riley's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "I'm a paramedic," his own voice replied, calm and focused. "This man is a firefighter. He's in respiratory distress. I need to treat him here." The camera showed Marcus not even looking up, his hands moving with purpose over the patient's chest, attaching EKG leads. The footage perfectly corroborated his story. His attention was, and remained, on saving a life. "I said step away, now!" Riley's voice repeated, louder this time. The camera tilted up as Riley stepped closer, looming over the scene. It captured Marcus's quick glance up, the firmness in his voice as he tried to explain the situation. "Officer, this is a critical medical scene. My patient has potential airway compromise. I cannot step away." Watching it now from Riley's perspective was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. Its gaze remained fixed on Marcus, the perceived source of defiance. It recorded Marcus's clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency and his lawful duty. It recorded his offer to have his credentials verified by other means. It recorded the moment he dismissed Riley to instruct Sarah to prepare for transport. Every action Marcus took was centered on patient care. Every action Riley took was centered on asserting his own authority. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Riley stepped forward to block him. His voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." His reply was just as clear. "You are obstructing emergency medical care." The video was a perfect second-by-second chronicle of one man trying to do his job and another man actively preventing him from doing it. It was a visual record of an abuse of power. The city's lawyers could argue about policy and procedure all they wanted, but they could not argue with what was on that screen. The camera didn't have a bias. It didn't have an opinion. It just showed what happened. The most crucial moment of the footage was the arrest itself. The video showed Riley reaching out and grabbing Marcus's shoulder. The image jolted, the microphone picking up the sound of fabric stretching. It showed him yanking Marcus away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the medical tray spilling across the ground, the gurney with the struggling firefighter, Sarah's shocked face. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of Marcus's back and the sky as Riley spun him around and forced his arms behind him. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. It was a sound that made Marcus flinch, even now, sitting in a comfortable conference room. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the firefighters. It showed Sarah, her face a mask of desperation, trying to manage the patient alone before others rushed to help. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance, and it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car where Marcus was pushed into the back seat like a piece of cargo. Riley didn't turn the camera off until he was driving away from the scene. When the video ended, the conference room was silent for a full minute. Sarah was shaking her head, her face pale. Marcus felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Riley's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Ben Carter sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Marcus. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest. It recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized. "This changes everything. Their strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Riley wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a man telling him he had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Carter stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a much bigger one. He turned to Marcus, his eyes glinting. But we are not going to take it. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens see what Officer Nolan Riley did on that scene. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Marcus. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws. The body camera footage had transformed the case from a he said, she said dispute into an open and shut case of misconduct. It was the wrecking ball that was about to demolish the city's entire defense. They had wanted to fight in the dark, with whispers and legal motions. Evelyn Reed was about to drag them into the light, and the truth, in high definition, was going to be blinding. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Nolan Riley walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. He wore a crisp uniform, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had at the fire scene. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's attorney led Riley through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area for the safety of all personnel, and paramedic Thorne's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with his lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job. Then, it was Evelyn Reed's turn. She began calmly, her questions simple and direct. "Officer Riley, you've been with the department for 6 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, ma'am. We receive extensive training." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Riley shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel." "That wasn't my question, officer," Reed said, her voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like establishing a non-critical perimeter?" The city's attorney objected, but Evelyn just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, firefighter Miller, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Riley said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Evelyn pounced. "You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct?" "I ordered him to step back so I could secure the scene." Evelyn nodded slowly, then turned to her paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit, body camera footage of Officer Riley, timestamp 14/18/05. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the fireground. Evelyn had Riley watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Evelyn said, pausing the video just after Riley had yelled, "I said step away, now!" At this point, you had been on scene for less than 30 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not conferred with the fire chief. Yet you decided the most important action was to stop the paramedic from treating his patient. Why? "I was establishing control of the scene," Riley repeated, his jaw tight. "Control over what, exactly? A man on his knees trying to save another man's life?" Evelyn let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Marcus calmly explained the patient's condition. She paused it again. Officer, on this video we can hear paramedic Thorne, a 25-year veteran with an exemplary record, telling you the patient has a compromised airway.
You understood that was a life-threatening condition, correct?
Riley hesitated. I understood it was a medical situation. And yet your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for him. It was to demand his identification. Is that right? It is standard procedure to identify all parties on a scene. Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing his dying patient over your request for his driver's license? Evelyn's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, she dismantled Riley's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. She forced him to watch himself yank Marcus away from the patient. Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer. Riley stared at the screen, his face pale. I am effecting an arrest. You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing him from rendering aid, Evelyn corrected him. Did you see the medical tray spill onto the ground? Did you see the patient left unattended while you focused on handcuffing Mr. Thorne? By the end of the deposition, Nolan Riley was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Evelyn Reed had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Evelyn's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The truth had been locked in, under oath. The day after the deposition, Evelyn Reed's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of defeat. They want to settle, Evelyn told Marcus later that day in his office. They know the deposition was a disaster. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value. She slid a piece of paper across his desk. On it was a number, $2,500,000. Marcus stared at the figure. It was an incredible amount of money, a life-changing sum. It was an admission of guilt, a clear signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. It was enough to pay off his mortgage, set up a college fund for his kids, and live without financial worry for years. Part of him, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. He wanted it to be over. This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it? Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. Evelyn nodded. Of course. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Riley's deposition transcript is never released. That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy his story, to bury the truth he had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay him to pretend this never happened. No, Marcus said, the single word firm and clear. No deal. A slow smile spread across Evelyn's face. This isn't about the money, Evelyn, Marcus continued. It's about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court, and I want a verdict that sends a message not just to this city, but to every police department in this country. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation. The first act was jury selection, or voir dire. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table beside Evelyn, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community. Teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide his fate. The city's legal team, led by a sharp, immaculately dressed man named Arthur Vance, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. Their questions were pointed. Do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question? And, do you have any family members who have had a negative experience with law enforcement? Evelyn Reed's approach was the opposite. She was searching for empathy and critical thinking. She was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. Her questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation, she posed to one group, where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a retired Air Force crew chief, answered without hesitation. You trust the expert in the relevant field. The firefighter knows fire. The cop knows the law. You don't ask a lawyer to put out a fire. Evelyn made a small, satisfied check mark on her notepad. Another potential juror, a young nurse, was questioned by the city's attorney. Do you believe police officers have a difficult and dangerous job? Vance asked. Of course, the young woman answered. And do you believe they sometimes have to make split-second decisions to maintain control? Yes, she said. But as a nurse, I also know that in any emergency, the first rule is do no harm. Creating a new crisis where one doesn't exist isn't control, it's chaos. Vance thanked her and moved on, but Evelyn's eyes lingered on the woman. She had found someone who could see the gray areas. The process took 2 full days. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The retired crew chief had made it. So had the young nurse. There was a high school science teacher, a stay-at-home father, a plumber, and several others. Evelyn was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority, but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which duty was more important. As they left the courthouse that evening, the reality of the situation finally hit Marcus with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. His life, his reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than himself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. The trial began not with Marcus, but with Dave Miller. Evelyn Reed knew that before the jury could understand the crime against Marcus, they had to understand the stakes. They had to see the human cost. Dave walked slowly to the witness stand, pulling a small, portable oxygen cart behind him. He was thinner than he had been in the deposition video, his face gaunt. The confident firefighter was gone, replaced by a man who looked decades older than his 38 years. Evelyn approached the witness stand, her demeanor gentle and respectful. Mr. Miller, could you please tell the jury what you remember from the afternoon of the fire? Dave took a sip of water, his hand shaking. Not much, he said, his voice raspy. I remember the heat. I remember my crew chief yelling to get out. Then, black smoke. It felt like breathing fire. He paused, taking a breath from his cannula. The next clear thing I remember is waking up in the hospital with a tube down my throat. Do you remember a paramedic being with you after you were brought out? Evelyn asked. I don't remember seeing him, Dave said, but I remember hearing him. It was foggy, like I was underwater, but I could hear a man's voice, calm, telling me to hang on, that he was there, that he wouldn't let me go. It was a lifeline. He looked directly at Marcus, who sat at the plaintiff's table, his own eyes glistening. And then I remember a lot of yelling. and we stopped moving. I just remember feeling trapped. I couldn't breathe, and we weren't going anywhere. The city's attorney, Arthur Vance, rose for cross-examination, his approach cautious. Mr. Miller, you have a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit filed against the city, correct? It seeks to cover my medical bills, Dave said, his voice gaining a spark of its former strength, and to provide for my family now that I can't work anymore. So you have a significant financial interest in the outcome of this trial, don't you? Vance pressed. Ma'am, Dave said, leaning forward, if I won the lottery tomorrow, it wouldn't fix my lungs. It wouldn't let me go back to my job. It wouldn't let me play catch with my sons.
He then turned his head and looked at the jury.
What this is about is time. The time that your police officer stole from me. Vance had no more questions. The next day, it was Marcus's turn. He walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. For an hour, Evelyn led him through his story, his training, and the events at the fire. His testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. He spoke not as a victim, but as a professional explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. Then, Evelyn walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Nolan Riley. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room was silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of that chaotic fire scene. They saw it not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw Marcus's focused professionalism. They saw Dave Miller's soot-covered, struggling face. They heard Riley's aggressive demands and Marcus's calm, firm refusals. And then they saw it. They saw Riley, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab Marcus. They saw him yank him away from his patient. They saw him spin him around and force his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman put her hand over her mouth in shock. A man in the back row, the retired Air Force crew chief, shook his head slowly in disgust. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore. They were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. After Marcus stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Nolan Riley. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. His lawyer led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She approached the witness stand not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. Officer Riley, she began, we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while he was actively treating a man in respiratory distress. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, is there anything you would have done differently? It was a lifeline, a chance for Riley to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, in hindsight, I should have waited. He could have said, I misjudged the situation. He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. No, Riley said, his voice defiant. I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene. Evelyn let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. She walked back to the plaintiff's table. No further questions, Your Honor. It was a mic drop moment. In that single, defiant answer, Nolan Riley had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. The jurors' faces were like stone. They had seen the video, and now they had seen the man, and in their eyes, there was no doubt left at all. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Arthur Vance, for the city, did his best with a losing hand. He argued that Officer Riley's actions, while perhaps not ideal, were made in a high-stress environment. Police officers don't have the luxury of slow-motion replays, he argued. They have to make split-second decisions. Officer Riley made a decision. It may not have been the perfect decision, but it was not a violation of the Constitution. Then Evelyn Reed rose to give her closing statement. She didn't shout. She didn't use flashy rhetoric. She spoke with a quiet, righteous anger that was far more powerful. She stood directly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each of them. "For 4 days we have talked about laws and procedures and amendments," she began. "But this case isn't about that. This case is about a choice. Officer Nolan Riley arrived at a scene where a man was on his knees fighting to keep another man breathing. And he had a choice. He could have chosen to help. He could have chosen to protect the scene for the medics. He could have chosen to be a partner. But he didn't." Evelyn walked over to the evidence table and picked up the pair of handcuffs used in the arrest, holding them up for the jury to see. Instead, he chose this. He chose his ego. He chose his authority. He looked at a life hanging in the balance and decided that seeing a paramedic's driver's license was more important. He chose to turn a medical rescue into a crime scene of his own making. She let the silence hang in the air. Marcus Thorne also had a choice. He could have complied. It would have been the easy thing to do. But he chose his oath. He chose his patient. He chose to honor his duty, even when it meant being humiliated, arrested, and caged like an animal. He chose to be a paramedic. She turned and pointed at Riley, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His decision cost Dave Miller his health and his livelihood. His decision is the only reason Dave Miller will be tethered to an oxygen tank for the rest of his life. Marcus Thorne's decision is the only reason Dave Miller is alive to tell his story today. Evelyn turned back to the jury, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The city wants you to excuse his action. But he sat on that stand yesterday and told you he wouldn't change a thing. He is asking you to ratify his behavior. He is asking you to tell every police officer in this country that it is acceptable to pull a first responder off a dying patient. Your verdict today will do more than decide this case. It will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value blind obedience over professional duty? Do we value ego over empathy? Do we value a badge over a human life? Send a message that the answer is no." The jury filed out of the room. The wait began. An hour passed. Then 2. Just after 3 p.m., the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman, the retired Air Force crew chief, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge, who read it, his expression unchanging, and handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. "In the matter of Thorne versus Riley and the city," the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "on the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Marcus Thorne." A gasp went through the courtroom. "On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Marcus Thorne." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut as tears began to stream down his face. Evelyn put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We will now read the damages," the clerk continued. "For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $2,300,000. The number was staggering, but the foreman wasn't finished. "And for punitive damages to be levied against Officer Nolan Riley and the city for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $19 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $21.3 million. It was a thunderous verdict. A number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish. It was a statement. The jury hadn't just sided with Marcus, they had adopted his outrage. They had sent the message Evelyn had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Marcus sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming sense of vindication. The jury had seen him, they had heard him, and they had believed him. Justice had been done. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, what drove Officer Nolan Riley? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, where compliance is the only measure of control. In his mind, Marcus's refusal to obey wasn't professional disagreement. It was a public challenge to his very identity as an officer. His badge was not a tool for service, it was armor for his fragile ego. If he had been able to pause, to listen, to see the struggling firefighter on the ground as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. And what of Marcus? If he had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of his past, would he have backed down? Perhaps. But his refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance. It was the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. His victory reminds us that true courage isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. This story